Tilde. Today I'd like to talk about the concept of oppression inflation. Not exactly a new idea, but I think it's something that bears a video to stimulate some thought and generally test out the veracity of the term and its basic concept. I'm going to do this in a couple of ways. First, I'm going to talk about a recent academic paper I had the misfortune of reading from a feminist in academia, and then I'm going to link that to the basic idea that we've seen growing in feminism, and then I'm going to bring it all back around to what exactly the idea of oppression inflation is. So to start, I recently read a paper about a feminist and queer discourse on the topic of female sex toys, specifically fake penises, or dildos. The entire paper read more like the author's awkward Tumblr blog diary of sex toy shopping in India than any actual discourse on social stigma and acceptance of masturbatory practices and AIDS. One of the key components of this paper, other than many flawed assertions about societal views of sexuality and how sex toys are somehow more difficult for women and minorities to obtain, flying in the face of any actual experience of entering sex shops in which the overwhelming majority of the products on offer are aimed at catering to women and their various pleasures, in shops overwhelmingly staffed by women because of the social stigma attached to men working in such positions as presumed perverts or sex offenders. The key concept was the idea that the dildo is becoming a symbol of female oppression in a phallocentric world. While the paper does make several nods to the historic importance that female sex toys have had on female empowerment and liberation in the West, in regards to historically breaking down previously prudish societal norms and making the topic of sex and self-pleasure a less taboo topic, it then proceeds to wrestle with feminism's links to such topics, and the author struggles to pass her straddling two camps of sex-positive feminism and sex-negative feminism. Why is this important? Well, it stems from the shift in paradigms that happens over time as people are exposed to certain ideas and certain technologies. Historically, while female sex toys have always had supporters and detractors, and do to this day, it is interesting to note that a social movement that was largely about women's choice and ability to be ever increasingly independent would increasingly turn against these choices, deeming them to be nothing more than patriarchal manipulations of women. A sex toy that was previously supposed to liberate women by removing the necessity of a man for sexual pleasure is becoming a symbol of how men oppress women by constantly reminding them that part of their sexual desire and pleasure includes men, assuming heterosexuality, of course. So as we can see, something that started as liberation and empowerment is becoming an oppression. This instance just happens to be in mid-flow, in transit from one to the other, as it were. Although there have been, and presumably always will be, division with supporters and detractors on both sides, it is key to note which side is dominant and the majority. This pattern, however, is something we've seen before. Take, for example, the existence of vacuum cleaners. Before the advent of vacuum cleaners, wall-to-wall carpeting was very uncommon and quite unfashionable, small area rugs being far more fashionable and common, assuming any sort of soft floor furnishing was used, since wood floors and stone flagging was the norm throughout most of history. This is owing to the necessity of cleaning said furnishings. The way to clean a rug is to take it outside, hang it over a rail, and vigorously pummel it with a racket, stick, or open hand, a laborious and time-consuming task indeed. Since historically the division of labour was often set along lines of sex, men taking jobs outside the home and women taking duties at home, since this was an effective division that ensured both domains were taken care of, this duty of vigorous laborious furnishing beatings often fell to women. Men, historically wanting to help women, despite what some feminists would claim that men universally hate women and want to subjugate them, came up with the invention of the vacuum cleaner, a device that pulls air through it, trapping small particles, dust, pollen, hair, etc., in a filter, enabling for it to be easily disposed of. This device was obviously a large improvement on the previous method of cleaning, being far less labour-intensive and much faster. Men, wanting their wives to not have to work as hard or as long in the home, would of course buy these devices for their wives, it not only serving the aforementioned labor-saving purpose, but also that being a status symbol of, look how little my wife has to work, I'm such a good provider. All around, it is a win, enabling women to spend less of their time working in the home, and thus more time either at leisure or seeking employ elsewhere, assuming they have enough time to do so. And interestingly, with this device, we see a similar pattern. Some modern feminists complaining that their grandfathers buying their grandmothers' vacuum cleaners was a means of keeping them oppressed by reminding them that their place was in the home because they hated women, flying in the face of the opinion of the actual women who had them bought for them, who would say that it was a wonderful labor and time-saving device that made their lives considerably easier. It's a simple pattern and one that repeats over and over and over. The invention of the bra, a quicker, easier-to-wear device to support the bust invented to replace the more restrictive, cumbersome, and time-consuming to don corset invented to make women's lives easier and better, the bra then, a couple of generations later, being burned as symbols of women's oppression by men. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, dishwashers, etc., all invented to make women's home lives quicker and easier, replacing older, more labor-intensive ways of working, embraced by one generation and seen as liberation from work, a couple of generations later, symbols of male oppression, reminding women they must serve men's interests and that their place is in the home. Now, the dildo, created to give women pleasure and enjoyments without the need for a man, embraced by one generation as liberating them from the need for men for sexual pleasure, a couple of generations later, a symbol of male oppression, reminding women that they need to serve and pleasure men and their penises. Finally, on to the concept of oppression inflation. Historically, men have always worked to attempt to benefit and provision women in whatever way they can. This is the reproductive method used by humans. A man competing with other men to enhance his own social status and leveraging this to attract and keep the interest of a woman or women. We can see this in the very well-documented preferences that women exhibit in mate preference in humans, and how it is inextricably linked to social status and provision within whatever society and social circle that applies, which to some may give the illusion that such a pattern doesn't exist when it in fact does, as I've spoken about in other videos talking about genetic links to behavior disposition, and how seemingly disparate behaviors can in fact be one and the same pattern of behavior, merely manifesting differently. So this pattern of men provide for women has been long since established, both behaviorally and socially within humans, which brings us to the modern day and what I've termed oppression inflation. In the West, there is very little to want for outside of areas of extreme poverty. Most people's basic needs and wants are taken care of one way or another when it comes to material life. Most everyone has somewhere to live, food to eat. Basically, the bottom two tiers of Maslow's hierarchy are taken care of in perpetuity. So it is difficult for anyone to claim true oppression in this regard, since historic oppression has involved extreme denial of these basics. Slavery, for example, deprives people of safety and potentially physiological needs. As such, it has become necessary for so-called liberation groups like feminism to invent ever smaller oppressions for people to face in order to justify their existence and continue to exploit the male need to give women what they want. This leads us to an interesting position of oppression inflation. In essence, we are printing the money, and as with printing more money, with each note minted, every other note loses a part of its value. So too, with every new oppression does every existing one lose a part of its value until there is an inevitable bust. Look around at what is being called oppression by feminists these days. How far apart men's knees are when riding public transport, better known as manspreading. How briskly men walk should they accidentally enter the personal space of a woman and make contact with her, termed manslamming. How men having work uniforms more strict than women, requiring them to wear shirts, long trousers, and jackets in offices regardless of the temperature and weather outside, as opposed to women being able to get away with simple jumper tops or more or less whatever they desire. The men will sometimes require the office to be cooler than women, owing to the extra layers they must wear on the job, and how this is sexism against women. And now even going so far as to how men are to interact with women, by only ever speaking to them at a time and in a way that a woman will be receptive to, lest they be accused of being entitled, catcalling, or misogyny. Yes, greeting a woman who is a stranger without first somehow psychically knowing if she finds you suitable enough to be seen speaking to in public can now be considered a hate crime in the city of Nottingham. This is the printing of the currency, the artificial inflation of oppression, attempting to legally mandate the third and fourth tiers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and thus it devalues the other so-called oppressions. And yet we seem compelled to constantly try and give women what they want in this. The appeal of female vanity is too strong, and men and women alike will continue to invent new oppressions that women face and invent new rights that they must be given in order for women to finally be considered free. The problem with this approach and why it is rapidly causing problems is as follows. When provisioning exists in a material sense, it is easy to see, easy to keep track of. You know if someone is being treated well because they have reliable shelter, they have reliable foods, they have access to their needs, bedecked in Veblen goods like jewellery. However, we have gone past just the material. We are now into the abstract of rights and laws, and these are as endless as human imagination and invention. There is no end to what hypothetical rights we can give women as long as they keep asking for them. Because women demand, men provide. That's how men get access to women, by being what women want them to be and doing what women want them to do. What we are seeing now, I believe, is the beginning of the sign of a potential bust at the end of the inflation. Instead of simply giving people a few basic rights that place no burden on others, such as the right to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, etc., we are now enacting rights under the charge of oppression that impose cost to others. The right to not be offended, the right to be forgotten, the right to feel safe at all times. These sorts of rights require a force enacted on all people to uphold, and yet we are slowly walking into creating such rights because feminists demand them under the guise of, won't somebody please think of the women's? Because this demand works. Is there a way to short this out? I don't know. Will there actually be a bust at the end of this inflation? I'm really not sure. People seem to be catching on and realizing it's becoming ridiculous. But is that realization going to be enough to snap people out of their pattern of give to women thought? I don't know. Or is this just the finale of the cycle of empires? Who knows? Just something to consider. As I said, it's not a particularly original observation or thought, but I just find terming it as something, in this case oppression inflation, removes the requirement of the full explanation of what it means and can just help speed up conversation around the topic. But hopefully it's given you a bit of food for thought.